Embedded power: the deep logic of Chinese government and economic development. Opening. How does the government ignite the economic engine? On China's vast land, economic development unfolds like a grand symphony, with the government as its conductor. From the dazzling lights of coastal cities to the rise of inland towns, the government's presence is ever present. People often ask, how exactly does the government drive economic growth? Is it a heavy-handed master planner or a nimble marketing guide? The answer is far from simple. Economic development is not just a piling up of numbers but a complex game of institutions, policies, and human dynamics. Today, we dive into embedded power, Chinese government and economic development to uncover the deep logic of government-economy interactions and decode the secrets of China's economic miracle. This book centers on the role of the Chinese government in economic development, dissecting how mechanisms like fiscal policy, land management, and local competition have shaped modern China. Its brilliance lies in breaking down complex economic phenomena into vivid stories, from the fervor of local government investment drives to the delicate balance of central-local dynamics, placing readers right inside the heart of policymaking. We'll explore this from four angles: the government's dual roles, the design and operation of institutions, the logic and costs of local competition, and the evolution of policy through trial and error, using real cases and data to reveal the drivers and dilemmas of China's economic rise. Chapter 1: The government's dual-face: dancing between planning and marketing. When discussing government and economy, people often swing between extremes. Either the government is an all-powerful planner or the market should be entirely free. Reality is far more nuanced. The Chinese government plays a unique dual role, acting as both rule-setter and market facilitator. It moves like a dancer, gliding between planning and markets, striving to maintain rhythm while avoiding missteps. Take Shenzhen as an example. In 1978, Shenzhen was a fishing village of fewer than 30,000 people, with an economy worth just 196 million yuan. The central government designated it a special economic zone, granting policy perks and the freedom to experiment. Land could be leased at low costs, foreign investors enjoyed tax breaks, and local authorities were allowed to test and learn. This released the water to raise fish strategy swiftly attracted capital and talent. In the 1980s, Hong Kong tycoon Li Ka-shing led the charge, investing in the Shikou industrial zone, sparking a wave of foreign capital. By 2023, Shenzhen's GDP had soared past 3.5 trillion yuan, making it one of China's most vibrant economic hubs. This miracle stems from the government's ability to pave the way for markets through policy innovation. Shenzhen's success is not an isolated case. In the 1980s, township enterprises sprouted like mushrooms in Wenzhou, Hejiang. The Wenzhou government allowed farmers to register collective businesses under a red hat to bypass planned economy restrictions. Entrepreneur Lin Xiang recalls how his family started with a second-hand sewing machine in 1985, leveraging lenient policies to pivot into a garment factory, becoming one of China's top shoe suppliers by the 1990s. By the late 1980s, township enterprises accounted for 60% of Wenzhou's economy, pioneering private sector growth. Yiwu's e-commerce boom further showcases the government's market-guiding prowess. In the 2000s, Yiwu's government seized the internet's potential, investing in the international trade city and rolling out e-commerce training and logistics subsidies. Merchant Shen Ruohan recalls transitioning from traditional wholesale to a Taobao store, boosted by free government e-commerce courses, growing her annual sales from 100,000 to 5 million yuan. By 2020, e-commerce transactions exceeded 400 billion yuan, capturing 20% of China's small commodity e-commerce market. Through infrastructure and policy support, the government injected fresh energy into the market. Yet, the government's role isn't always about letting go. During the 2008 global financial crisis, China launched a 4 trillion yuan stimulus package, spanning infrastructure, affordable housing, and more. Data shows this plan directly fueled 9.1% GDP growth in 2009, stabilizing the economy. But it came with side effects. Local debt surged, and some areas saw ghost cities, like Kongbashi New Area in Inner Mongolia, with a 70% vacancy rate. In Yunnan's Yuxi, for instance, the local government built a high-speed rail new area to spur growth, but low demand left buildings over 50% empty, straining finances. This reminds us that balancing the visible hand and invisible hand is critical. The government's dual role also manifests in central-local dynamics. The central government sets macro policies, while locals execute them, but locals are far from mere implementers. Before the 1994 tax-sharing reform, local governments controlled 70% of fiscal revenue, leaving the central government strapped. Post-reform, the central government claimed more taxes but shifted spending duties to locals, creating a central government hosts, local government pays dynamic. This pushed local governments to seek new revenue streams, birthing land financing. Data reveals that from 1998 to 2020, national land sales revenues exceeded 50 trillion yuan, accounting for over 30% of local fiscal income. Land financing fueled urbanization but also planted seeds of a real estate bubble. In Guangzhou, for example, land sales in the 2000s funded the Pearl River City, attracting hundreds of corporate headquarters, but soaring land prices drove up housing costs, burdening residents. Chapter 2: Institutional gears the mechanics of fiscal and land systems. If the government is the conductor of economic development, fiscal and land systems are the core notes of the score. They are not just material foundations but the critical gears of policy execution. Embedded power delves into how fiscal and land institutions drive China's economy, while exposing their underlying logic and contradictions. Fiscal: the central-local tug-of-war over the money bag. Fiscal policy is the lifeblood of government-driven economic growth. The 1994 tax-sharing reform marked a turning point in China's fiscal history. Before the reforms, local governments held a feudal grip on finances, with the central government collecting just 30% of revenue, struggling to fund national projects. Post-reform, the central government secured 75% of taxes through major levies like VAT, leaving locals with fragmented sources like business taxes. This grab the big, release the small design bolstered central control but left local budgets strained. To bridge the gap, local governments turned to land financing. In Wenzhou, for instance, the 1990s saw the local government use land sales to attract manufacturing firms. Entrepreneur Hang Ruanen recalls how the government offered land at 100,000 yuan per mu with tax breaks, luring her family business from trading to manufacturing. By 2000, Wenzhou's industrial output topped 100 billion yuan, with private enterprises driving 90% of the economy. Land finance not only funded local governments but also spurred growth through infrastructure. The fiscal system also gave rise to local financing platforms. After the 2008 financial crisis, local governments borrowed heavily through urban investment companies for infrastructure. In Chongqing, the 2010s saw over 5 trillion yuan invested via financing platforms, building subways and the Longjiang New Area, boosting GDP from 800 billion yuan in 2010 to 2.5 trillion in 2020. But towering debts brought risks, with Chongqing's urban investment debt exceeding 1 trillion yuan by 2023, creating immense repayment pressures. The Chengdu-Chongqing economic circle highlights the complexity of fiscal tug-of-war. In 2019, the central government launched the Dual City Economic Circle strategy, with Chongqing and Chengdu pooling 300 billion yuan through joint financing platforms for high-speed rail and tech parks. Entrepreneur Wei Zihao recalls his smart manufacturing firm in Chengdu's high-tech zone doubling output in 3 years, thanks to tax breaks and R&D subsidies. By 2023, the economic circle's GDP surpassed 7 trillion yuan, but fiscal rivalry led to redundant investments, like both cities building underused convention centers with occupancy below 50%. The flip side of fiscal dynamics is tax policy shifts. In 2015, the central government's VAT reform replaced business taxes, further shrinking local revenue streams. Locals leaned harder on land sales, inflating housing prices. Data shows that in 2020, home prices in 70 major cities rose 5.8% on average, with Shenzhen seeing over 15% hikes. High prices burden residents and deepen local economies' reliance on real estate, creating a land finance dependency syndrome. In Hangzhou, for example, land sales made up 40% of fiscal revenue in 2021, but a cooling real estate market slashed income, forcing public spending cuts. Landing, the engine of urbanization. The landing system is another pillar of China's economic takeoff. Post-1978 reforms introduced paid land use, with local governments as sole suppliers. This gave locals immense power over resource allocation. In Beijing, before the 2008 Olympics, land sales raised over 300 billion yuan for venues and infrastructure. Iconic structures like the Bird's Nest and Water Cube were backed by land financing. The land system's logic is generate wealth through land, build with wealth. Local governments acquire land cheaply, sell it at high prices, and reinvest profits in infrastructure, attracting businesses and residents, which further drives up land values in a virtuous cycle. Shanghai's Pudong New Area exemplifies this model. In 1990, Pudong was a rural backwater, but government-led land development drew multinational firms. By 2023, Pudong's GDP exceeded 1.5 trillion yuan, accounting for a third of Shanghai's economy. The Greater Bay Area further demonstrates land's power. In 2017, the central government unveiled the Bay Area Plan, with Guangdong's local governments integrating land and policies to attract tech giants like Tencent and Huawei to Shenzhen and Guangzhou. Entrepreneur Xiao Ruoxi recalls her startup in Dongguan's Songshan Lake securing cheap land and tax breaks, growing into a drone industry leader. By 2023, the Bay Area's GDP topped 13 trillion yuan, rivaling New York's. Yet, land finance has clear downsides. Over-reliance on land sales wastes resources and harms the environment. In Yunnan's Kunming, the 2010s saw aggressive development around Dianqi Lake, shrinking wetlands by 30% and fouling water quality. Resident Zhu Zikai recalls Dianqi as his childhood playground, now reduced to a stinking ditch. In Hebei's Tangshan, the Chaophydian New Area involved massive land reclamation, but slow progress yielded returns below 10%, sparking fiscal woes. In Shaanxi's Taiyuan, the 2000s saw the Fen New Area built on vast farmland, cutting village arable land by 50% and fueling social tensions as farmers lost livelihoods. Chapter 3. The Frenzy of Local Competition Drivers and Costs. A hallmark of China's economic growth is fierce competition among local governments. Like athletes on a racetrack, they vie for investment, build industrial parks, and chase projects. This rivalry fuels growth but exacts a steep toll. The investment rush. Staking claims. Local competition often starts with attracting investment. In the 1990s, coastal cities led the land grab charge. In Suzhou, a 1994 partnership with Singapore birthed the Suzhou Industrial Park, offering tax breaks and land subsidies to lure firms like Intel and Philips. By 2020, the park's GDP topped 300 billion yuans, making up 15% of Suzhou's economy. This land for capital model spread nationwide. Competition is driven by performance metrics. GDP growth, fiscal revenues, and jobs are key to officials' promotions. In the 2000s, Taizhou, Hejiang's mayor Wang Kaiming launched an industry-first strategy, using cheap land and tax breaks to attract firms like Geely Auto. Geely grew from a small motorcycle maker to a global giant, with a 2023 market value of over 200 billion yuan. Wang's success earned him a swift promotion to provincial leadership. Competition also fosters industrial clusters. In the Pearl River Delta, Dongguan's government used land perks and supply chain support to draw firms like Foxconn. By the 2000s, Dongguan was the world's largest electronics manufacturing hub, with exports accounting for 10% of China's total. Worker Li Heiren recalls a decade on Foxconn's assembly line, his monthly pay rising from 2,000 to 8,000 yuans, lifting his living standards. But prosperity brought challenges. Rising labor costs pushed some firms to Vietnam and India. The solar industry's boom and bust encapsulates local competition. In the 2010s, Wuxi's government poured billions in subsidies into Suntec Solar, making it a global leader. But a 2013 market slump bankrupted Suntec, saddling locals with massive debt. Wuxi's lessons spurred a shift to innovation-driven firms like LONGi Green Energy, which by 2023 held 30% of global solar module shipments, revitalizing the industry. Local debt, a hidden time bomb. The frenzy of competition also birthed a debt crisis. To fund projects, local governments created financing platforms, borrowing through banks and bonds. Fiscal Ministry data shows that by 2023, local debt exceeded 40 trillion yuan, or 30% of GDP. In Tianjin, post-2008, the Binhai area borrowed over 500 billion yuan for ports and parks. While its GDP doubled in the 2010s, crushing debt interest strained local budgets. The debt crisis stems from land financing dependency. When land sales revenues fell, locals borrowed to keep going. After the 2020 pandemic, a cooling land market slashed fiscal income. In Henan's Zhengzhou, hundreds of billions in urban investment bonds funded the Hongdong area, but a real estate slump stalled projects, spiking repayment pressures. In Hubei's Yichang, over 100 billion yuan in debt for the Three Gorges new area yielded occupancy below 30%, ballooning deficits. The costs and reflections of competition. Competition's toll extends beyond economics to society and the environment. Rapid urbanization widened urban-rural gaps. In the 2010s, Guizhou chased GDP with high-speed rail and new areas, lifting Guiyang's GDP from 100 billion yuan in 2010 to 400 billion in 2020. But rural infrastructure lagged, with 10% of the population still in poverty. Villager Yang Xiulan recalls her hometown school closing for lack of funds, forcing kids to study 100 kilometers away. Environmental costs are stark. In the 2000s, Inner Mongolia's coal boom led to strip mining, expanding desertification by 20%. Herdsman Batu recalls green pastures turning to sand, his flock shrinking from 500 to under 100 sheep. In Shaanxi's Dadong, the energy capital pushed over mined coal, lowering groundwater and doubling farmland irrigation costs. Short-term performance drives often sacrifice long-term sustainability. Chapter 4: Policy Trials and Institutional Evolution, Resilience and Challenges. Behind China's economic miracle lies not just top-down design but countless trials and institutional evolution. Embedded Power dissects reform paths and global challenges, revealing the government's resilience and wisdom, while pointing to future hurdles. The wisdom of trial and error, from grassroots to nationwide. China's success owes much to crossing the river by feeling the stones. In 1978, farmers in Shaogang village, Anhui, risked signing a household contract pact, doubling grain output that year. This grassroots experiment won central approval, and by 1982, the household responsibility system spread nationwide, boosting agricultural output by 50% in the 1980s. Shaogang's success highlights local and grassroots innovation, setting a reform template. Township enterprise reform is another case. In the 1980s, Jiangsu's Sunan region saw township firms flourish. Changzhou's government let farmers start collective businesses to skirt planned economy rules. Entrepreneur Gu Minghua recalls using a village's abandoned factory in 1986 to launch a textile firm, backed by low-interest loans and tax breaks, hitting 100 million yuan in output by the 1990s. The Sunan model spread, with township firms contributing 25% of GDP in the 1990s, bolstering rural economies. Trials come with costs. The 1990s state-owned enterprise reforms triggered mass layoffs. From 1998 to 2003, about 30 million state workers lost jobs. In Shenyang, Liaoning, worker Hang Gilin recalls being laid off after 20 years at a state textile plant, surviving by street vending. Later government retraining and social security eased tensions, but the layoffs pain underscores the need for reform to balance efficiency and fairness. Reform pathways, from incremental to structural. China's reforms follow a distinct incremental first approach. In the 1980s, the government prioritized new growth through special economic zones and coastal cities, avoiding direct state firm overhauls. In Hainan, named a special economic zone in 1988, the government granted broad policy autonomy. Entrepreneur Lin Xiang invested in Haikou real estate, leveraging land perks and tax breaks to amass wealth. By 2020, Hainan's free trade port policy drew over 1,000 firms, boosting tax revenue by 30%. By the 21st century, reforms shifted to structural adjustments. In the 2000s, the central government pushed state firm marketization through mergers and listings. China Petroleum, for instance, listed in Hong Kong in 2000, adopting market-driven management, reaching a 2023 market value of 1.5 trillion yuan. Local governments also drove structural reforms. Dao, Shandong, used to clear the cage, changed the bird strategy, turning inefficient textile plants into high-end manufacturing parks, hitting 200 billion yuan in output by 2020. Structural reforms' challenge is interest realignment. In the 2010s, supply-side structural reforms tackled overcapacity. From 2016 to 2020, steel capacity was cut by 1.5 million tons, affecting thousands of workers. In Tangshan, Hebei, steel plant manager Hao Ruoxi recalls her factory's closure, but government training and startup subsidies helped her pivot to logistics. Still, inadequate support in some areas sparked discontent. Hong'an new area reflects bold structural reforms. In 2017, the central government launched Hong'an in Hebei, using centralized land management and green development to build a city of the future. With 200 billion yuans invested in infrastructure, it drew tech giants like Baidu and Alibaba. By 2023, Shenzhen's GDP topped 50 billion yuans, but high costs raised debt concerns, highlighting reform's complexity. Globalization's challenges, from followers to leaders. China's rise hinges on globalization, but it brings new hurdles. US-China trade tensions and tech decoupling forced a rethink of development. In 2018, US sanctions hit Huawei's chip supply. Huawei ramped up R&D, covering 70% of its product lines with self-developed chips by 2023, holding 30% of the global 5 grams equipment market. Local governments fueled innovation. Shenzhen's tech funds and industry academia partnerships supported over 1,000 tech firms, with R&D spending at 5.8% of GDP in 2023. Globalization demands better alignment with international rules. In the 2010s, China's Belt and Road Initiative expanded markets through infrastructure. In Pakistan, China's Gwadar port boosted local GDP by 20%, but cultural clashes and debt risks emerged. Local governments must innovate to globalize firms. Xiamen, Fujian, set up overseas investment centers, helping SMEs enter Southeast Asia, boosting exports by 15% in 2023. Digital transformation and governance. Digital technology is revolutionizing governance. In the 2010s, the central government streamlined, regulated, served reform digitized approvals. In Hejiang, the 2016 Hejiang Service app integrated over 1,000 services, letting residents handle IDs and social security with one trip. By 2023, Hejiang's business environment ranked first nationally, attracting 5,000 SMEs. Smart city initiatives boosted efficiency. Shanghai's big data and AI-powered traffic system cut congestion by 15% in 2023. Citizen Shen Ruohan recalls using the Shanghai Service app to check bus times, streamlining her commute. Digital transformation enhances services and growth, but faces challenges like data privacy and urban digital divides. Conclusion: Embedded power, vision for the future. Embedded power, Chinese government and economic development, is more than an economics book, it's a mirror reflecting China's economic miracle and its tensions. As conductor, the government wields fiscal, land, competition, and triple and error tools to compose a grand symphony. Shenzhen's rise, Wenzhou's private economy, Pudong's leap, and Honggan's vision showcased its ingenuity and resolve. But discordant notes, debt crises, environmental costs, urban-rural gaps remind us that growth demands long-term vision. Embedded in the heart of it, we see a complex, real China. The government's dual roles, institutional gears, local rivalries, and reforms' trials and triumphs shaped its economic tapestry. Looking ahead, the government must balance planning and markets, growth and fairness, short-term gains and long-term goals. Aging populations, real estate slumps, and global uncertainties loom, yet digital transformation opens new governance paths. On the global stage, China must shift from tech followers to rule setters, embracing challenges with openness. As the book notes, economic development is not just a numbers game but an institutional chess match. Let's stay embedded in the heart of it, with wisdom and courage, to meet the next move in this grand game, crafting a sustainable, inclusive future in the digital and global era.